Today, we're going to talk about three general topics. As Kathy mentioned, executive compensation trends, share a little bit of data with you about what we see going on just in general. Secondly, whether or not you might want to make mid-year changes due to COVID. And then finally, what are we actually seeing that has happened due to COVID with compensation programs? So let's start out with executive comp trends. It's always interesting to look at this particular study, which has been done annually for decades by World at Work. There's about 5,000 companies who provide their data to help organizations understand the following year's pay increases. And as finance executives, I know you're very closely involved with the setting of those each year. And as you can see, I have circled both the actual 2020 as well as the 2021 row there, which is representing officers and executives. But even if you look at the other categories here, we have seen for several years it hovering right around 3. Maybe 10 years ago when we had the downturn economically, they were down to 2.5 and have come slowly up to 3. So regardless of COVID, companies are looking at 3%. Now, these are companies giving raises. So at the very end of the presentation, I have a data point showing a lot of companies next year are going to delay merit, but if they're giving it, this is probably in the ballpark traditionally where it's been, and it looks like we'll stay. I always like to look at annual incentive payouts, and this slide I like because it shows that there's a nice bell curve, and having studied too many statistics courses, you want to see this, right? The bell curve, where the majority of companies are in the middle within a standard deviation, and then, you have outliers at the ends. The reason this is important is because company by company, it varies. You may have a great payout one year, you may have no payout another year, but on average, companies will pay out at target every 3 to 5 years is a rule of thumb. Another thing I look at is, okay, how many are at the payout of target? And in this tallest row here, or column, it's 26%. But if I add up all the ones that are at or above target, it's about 58%, which seems about right. Half above, half below. This slide is the same study, but prior year, and you can see the same trend, half above, roughly, half below. And this is what we normally see in the market. And this will be very interesting, and I'm very curious to see next year's study because I am not expecting to see this bell curve. And that's really because if companies are not changing their plans, they're not going to have as many as, say, 58% paying at or above target, quite frankly. Now, if they've made changes to their plans, that could modify that, obviously. But, time will tell what will happen. So another aspect about annual incentive plans that I always find interesting to keep a pulse on is how many measures are people using in plans. And this is important because you want to have your plan set up so it motivates your participants, right? That's the whole reason to have the plan and invest the monies into having a plan. So 2 measures has been the norm for some period of time. And as you can see on the far right there, and my far right is actually covered up. Is there any way to close those pictures for a second? Let me see if I can do that. Because I can't see that box on the right, but I bet you can. Okay, so within those 2 measures, the most common vehicles are a blend of using restricted stock, that's that dark blue box on the bottom, and performance shares and units. So Uh, this has become more common probably over the last 10 years, maybe 15. Again, after the economic crash and the market was so low, because restricted stock is considered a time-based measure, or in other words, free money. If you stick around at the end of the period, you will get this kind of what I call free money or free stock. The other half is performance-based. So, the company has to perform and hit its targets to have that paid out. And companies use the time-based because they need to have retention. And a generation ago or so, stock options were so common because the market was going up, 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 and it was always a win-win-win. So over time, if you're a more experienced person, you know that this is kind of how things have evolved. Let me get my screen back. Okay, so this next slide I find very interesting. It talks about year-over-year goal setting, and as finance executives, again, I know you're the ones that are heavily involved in making that decision. I find it interesting that 53%, as I have circled on the right there, have set their goals at least at the prior year actual results or above prior year results. Now, you gotta say, that's strange that number's not higher, because why would you set your financial goals lower than the prior year's actual results? But in the case of this year, we got a great example of why that could be. COVID, at the beginning of this year, when the majority of goals were set, we didn't anticipate that the economy was just going to fall out in some industries. Some it hasn't, some it has. So again, very interesting. And it's by industry too, interesting to study how they change and adjust those goals from year to year. And that's so important because that's all hitting your bottom line. So let's talk about long-term incentives for a bit here. And when I say long-term incentives, this is any incentive plan that is more than a year. So 2 or more years or longer is considered a long-term incentive. And again, the most common approach is to use 2 measures as well, as you can see by the second box there. Here on this slide shows, let me turn off my little pictures again on the right so I can see the whole right chart. On the left side, it shows annual incentive metrics that are used. And number 1, 55% are using EBITDA or EBIT, a profit measure. Second most prevalent is sales or revenue measure. And some other combinations of those on the annual side. On the right side, the long-term measures, total shareholder return is the most common. And that has slowly ratcheted up in prevalence over the last 10 years when the ISS started giving more guidance around the fact that they like that measure. They didn't mandate using it, obviously, but I think companies sometimes want to do what peers are doing. And so anyway, that's gradually risen over the years. But you can see EPS is right under that, as well as, say, an EBITDA measure, which those are most common I see in long-term incentive plans. And I'm going to go back to putting my pictures up. Sorry. Okay, this slide is really related to the prior slide in the sense that that long-term incentive, total shareholder return measure, and the greatest prevalence of those measures, right, for long-term incentive plans. And I find it interesting here, well, first of all, they're showing from left to right, 2017, 18, 19, that gradual increase from 60 to 62 to now 65%, use that in their long-term plans. But most importantly is what I have circled. 91% of companies who use that measure use a relative comparator group. So they're not looking at, say, an absolute total shareholder return of their own, but then they have changed to say, okay, we're going to look at how our peers did and compare how we did versus the peers. And so that helps kind of mitigate the effects of a volatile up and down stock market. So if you look in the left box row, which says absolute, you'll see those measures, the remainder measures, are all more absolute. I have to hit X dollars, X capital efficiency, and so on. So anyway, just wanted to make sure that you were aware, because that's really become a popular trend. Shutting off my window here again. Actually, I think I'm just going to leave my pictures off. Then I won't have to keep going back and forth. Okay, so another aspect about long-term incentives is vesting. And this trend has been pretty continually the same over many years. The chart on the left shows that the most common vesting is 3 years. Now you can see on the far left, 1 year or less. I wouldn't call that long-term incentive, but a few use that. Very few use 2 years, and then very few also on the far right use 4 and 5 years. So again, 3 seems to be the magic number. On the right side, there's different ways that the long-term vesting occurs. And the most common on the far right in that circle, the pie chart, is what is called installment or step vesting at 63%. And this is just showing restricted stock as an example, but other types of equity vest similarly, meaning the majority are using step vesting, whereas a minority use the cliff, meaning you get nothing until the entire period is over. And the greatest reason to have an installment vesting is for retention and motivation purposes. So companies keep giving out and paying out each year versus having to wait a much longer period of time before the payout happens. The next slide, I wanted to provide you with some compensation data. When everyone hears, executive compensation presentation, I want to get some numbers, some data, what's going on in the market? Because as individuals, we all want to know, what is my job worth out in the market? Luckily, there's a lot of third-party, high-quality published sources that provide that data. And your HR or total rewards departments are purchasing that to help ensure that you're paying appropriately compared to whatever your industry group or size company is. So this highlights the differences in pay if you're a small company versus a very large company. And this trend holds true if you are definitely a CFO, CEO, any C-suite, vice presidents, maybe directors. If you are a manager level or individual contributor, I see less pay differences, small to large. The other time it really varies is by industry. If you're in high tech, it's very common they're going to be paying usually at the 75th or 90th percentiles because they want to get the cream of the crop. But it really is driven by one industry and also then size of organization. So here on the far left, if you're in a small company, say 10 to 50 million, your base, which is the bottom bar, is 231. The middle is the annual bonus, 150, and that's target, by the way, not actual. And that's the median, the 50th percentile target. And then the top, or the green box, is the long-term incentive. So if you look across all of them, it's like base salary is about half, and then the other two combined are about half. And that's because as you get higher in the organization, the philosophy is that you directly impact the bottom line more, so you should have more pay at risk. And so if you were to look at the same data bars for a CEO, you would see on average their salary is only 20% or less than 50%. And then they have even more pay at risk. And then if you look at lower level jobs, again, you're going to find they have more salary as part of the whole pay mix and less long-term and less bonus. So anyway, that's just a 101 on what we see with the total comp picture.
Linda, before you go on to this next section, because it's a lot of data, we had one question come in. I'll maybe throw out to you now. It's, I know, unless you're going to address it later. What is the range of salary cuts for C-suite executives at businesses hit by COVID?
There's no one right answer for that. I will show you a couple examples.
Okay.
But really, there's no one right answer. It really depends on your organization's individual situation. But I will cover some considerations, some guidance, and might at least give you some helpful tidbits to help make those decisions.
Okay, great. Thank you.
So if an organization is looking at mid-year changes, and it may be another year, it may not be COVID. I remember working in a large corporation and this topic came up. We've got to do something. We know our annual plan's not paying out. What should we do? What can we do? And so there was a very significant study done because we knew the plan wasn't going to pay out. At the end of the day, we actually did nothing different, but nonetheless, had to look at it. So affordability is a key driver, right? If not the most key driver. But looking at other changes already made, and in a little bit, I'm going to walk through COVID results and impacts on plans as COVID's evolves from March to the current. And these salary studies I'm showing you are just sample sizes. So it's not the entire universe. So we really don't have our arms around holistically what's happened. Next year, I think we can go back and ask people after we get through this, and we'll have more specific answers. But for now, we're all kind of, wading through and making the best decisions we can. But looking at other changes already made, looking at which employee groups you're impacting, thinking about optics to not only the market, but to your other employees. If you're going to make furloughs for lower level employees, what are you doing for your senior employees and executives? Are you going to have reductions in force? Ford just announced yesterday they're having early retirement packages for 1,400 salaried workers. So each day we're learning more and we're hearing more about how organizations are reacting to this horrible situation we're going through. The SEC has also provided some guidance, which I'm going to share a little more specifically. But as you're thinking about making the changes, think about all the impacts on the constituents and how is it going to impact employee engagement. So back to the SEC guidance, they're all about disclose. Whatever you're going to do mid-year, the guidance is be thorough, provide a lot of rationale, answer questions, facts you've looked at if you do decide to make changes in your incentive plans. And here's some of the categories they define. And I actually have in front of me the actual topic number 9A. And there's 51 questions in here they ask companies to ask themselves as you're determining if you want to make changes, such as, have you accessed revolving lines of credit or raised capital in the public or private markets to address your liquidity needs? Are your disclosures regarding these actions and any unused liquidity sources providing investors with a complete discussion of your financial condition and liquidity? Have you ceased any material business operations or disposed of a material asset or line of business? Have you materially reduced or increased human capital resources expenditures? Are these measures temporary in nature? And if so, how long do you expect to maintain them? And the questions go on and on. but it's an extremely great piece that gives you pretty much every potential angle to think about, as especially finance leaders, when you're looking holistically at the organization and how you're getting through COVID. Now, this slide I like, because, and it's from McKinsey. They did a study. This data is stock prices as of June 26th. But the point is, they're trying to make the point that the dark blue bars are how companies have come back, okay? So on the far left, you have aerospace that went down the farthest, 35%. Now, they were even further when COVID hit, they were down 50%. So that's what the light blue is. So the light blue bottom is how bad it got. And then as you go up to the top of the bars, that's kind of how good or how well they proceeded to improve as of June 26th. So you can see again, aerospace is still not doing good. And we've got air and travel, banks, oil and gas on the left, not doing good. Insurance not doing good. On the far right, we have high tech doing good, consumer services, healthcare, pharmaceuticals. So again, every industry is impacted differently. So I show this because it's such an interesting dichotomy that our stock market is at the levels it is, right? And share prices vary by industry, as we see. But as we're making decisions on changing incentive plans and serving our constituents, like our shareholders are going to be concerned about stock price mostly, right? So it'll be very interesting to see how this all shakes out at the end of the year when we're in a recession, yet the stock market's up so high, and how is that all going to be perceived by these shareholders, shareholder groups, employees, everyone that's involved. So interesting points of view. To the one question about that was raised, here's one example, and you may have heard about this, FedEx. The CEO is taking a 91% salary cut. I had to read through the article a little more to find out it's temporary. Okay, that changes things a little, doesn't it? Which is fair. It's for 6 months. I think it was April to October. But anyway, optics, if you work in a large public company, are everything. They also announced that there's not going to be any bonuses in 2020. They're still thinking about if there's going to be bonuses in 2021. They've had furloughs. On the other hand, they have done a one-time equity grant to key officers. So again, this is really a very delicate balance of how do we get through this? How do we make sure we're retaining and motivating our leaders to run the businesses and stay engaged in this period of time we've never gone through? Something else that's happened to them kind of along the same time frame is that their Teamsters were not happy at all with the executive's long-term incentive plan. And they actually sent a letter to them after 2019 saying that they used only earnings per share growth is the single metric and that it was not appropriate as compared to their competitors. And then they also said that they thought the financial goals were soft or low, and that this was not really producing the best shareholder returns. So as a result, FedEx is actually changing their program now for the 21 to 23 plan year. So they're going to add a second measure. As we talked about before, 2 measures is the most common to use. So they'll have earnings per share at a 75% weighting, and then capital expenditures divided by revenue over the cumulative 3-year period at a 25% weighting. So that adds a little balance to avoiding excessive executive pay. And that's relative, what's excessive, what's not. I'm sure those executives work hard and earn it, So anyway, I'm just showing you the optics and the reality of the impacts of all the shareholders involved. So what options do you really have to make changes in incentive plans? Well, one is leave the plan as is, let it run out. If you're not going to hit the goals, that's going to happen, and add a supplemental temporary plan just for, say, the 1 year to get through this. Seeing that done, it's a little complex to have two plans versus one, but regardless of which choice you do, communication is key. I actually have a slide on that next. So modifying the goals. A lot of organizations are modifying the goals, okay? We don't know exactly how many, but we know that is definitely going on. Another option, which is probably not used all that much, but can be very effective, is to eliminate the plan. And this assumes that your legal plan document has verbiage, and I've never seen one not have it, that the company has a right to terminate a plan at any time. So you want to make sure that is in your legal plan documents if it's not, but so you have the ability and the flexibility to replace it with a different plan. And so putting in a quarterly plan, especially in this volatile economic period we're in, especially depending on your industry. If it's not impacting your industry, then this is not even an issue. Another factor that I see happening, you'll see in a slide in a minute, is companies are adding discretion. And that means, okay, the results are what they are, but at the end of the year, the board or the senior leadership, depending on which plan population we're talking about, can make discretion a factor. And then even though results were A, they're going to raise the payout to B, C, a higher value. We also see less commonly discretion used on a negative basis. So if you were getting a payout of a higher value, the board sometimes will say, okay, we're going to hold that back and we're going to reduce it. So that actually happens as well. Another option is to add a qualitative goal. So opposed to a quantitative financial goal, a qualitative goal would be some operational measure, something that is not necessarily impacting profit per se directly, but it could be a strategic goal. It could be, how we've managed through COVID in some more defined specific ways. But operational goals and qualitative goals are not uncommon in incentive plans for executives. So I see that a lot. And then there's always the one-time, say, high performer or high potential employee, giving them some kind of a retention bonus. So if there's key people in your organizations you are most concerned about retaining in this time, that's an answer. And I've seen those pay out either 1 year, 2 year, usually 1 and 2 years. And then sometimes you pay out half up front, half at the end, or just at the end of the period. So there's different ways those can be structured, but those are an effective tool to use. And then finally, do nothing. Leave it as is and just keep moving forward.
Linda, can you comment on what kind of operational goal changes you're seeing at these mid-year now for some mid-market type companies?
Well, I would say productivity would be one. Safety could be one. Those are traditionally solid operational measures. Quality control. But yeah, there's a long list we could provide if anyone wants more detail.
All right, great. Thank you for that.
So communication is key. I touched on that. And it's key for changing your plans this year. Everyone knows we are going through uncharted waters. Communication is key because people want to understand what and why. And that's why all constituents involved should be communicated with if there is a plan change, or if there's not even. It doesn't hurt to over communicate ever. And that would be to your shareholders, to your board, to the employees, press releases, media, particularly if you're public, maybe even if you're private. And the public filings, obviously, as the SEC stated, to be extremely thorough in discussing any disclosures that are made. And because communication is key here, I like to always say, you can have the best compensation plan out there, but if your employees do not understand how it works, it may not get you the biggest bang for the buck. So even in normal times, communication is really, really key. And I have run into many executives that don't understand the equity plans that they're in. And you want them to understand because you want them to motivate and drive toward achieving those business results. So just as an aside, that's also equally, if not more, important. Here's some information, research I've uncovered through March to current. And again, remember, these are all sample sizes. It doesn't reflect what everybody's doing. And I've got them in order of early on in March. So this first study was shown in March. And then each one, works up to the current, let's say in August. So when we realized COVID was an issue, one study found that 65% of the organizations at the time were making no changes and still planning to pay out their prior year goals. So that would have been for 2019 performance to be paid out in 2020. 26%, which I think is kind of a high number because in March, that was pretty premature, but 26% were still evaluating whether they should pay them out or defer them or hold off or whatever. So a lot were being prudent then. I think that's a sizable number. Then in second quarter, there was a study done of the Russell 3000 companies, and that determined that 84% of them made cuts to CEO-based salaries, and many, almost as many, to the NEOs, to the named executive officers. And over half reduced their board of directors cash retainers. So that was second quarter. So there's more detail around that if anyone is interested. I know the one person who asked the question about what's the extent of it, we can give you this document as well.
Great, Linda. One more question that came up before you go on. So with mid-year changes, with the fact that companies have closed the books, at least through July and soon August, if there are mid-year changes, when would those changes be effective? July 1st, August 1st, or possibly September or year end?
It's up to the company. You really have to look at your own situation, and you can make that change at any time you believe that's appropriate. So there's really no one right answer to that. I hate to say there's no one right answer, but so often in consulting, that's how it is, because each organization, I believe, is a living and breathing organism which changes over time. It's alive. It changes. It grows. It shrinks. It evolves. So it's really hard to give a one-size-fits-all answer.
Okay, thank you.
So this next chart, I understand, is a total eye chart, and you might not be able to read it, especially if you printed the deck out in black and white like I did earlier this morning. But I'll walk you through what I find are the key highlights. And this study, again, was done second quarter. So 15% of participants said that they're making adjustments to annual merit increases. Now, 15%, I'm surprised that's not higher. My theory for it not being higher is probably they were given out already, in January. A lot of companies have merit increases aligned to their fiscal year, and a lot of them are January 1. And, some companies like retail is usually, February Other industries are June, July. So that varies by your industry as well, but surprised that number wasn't bigger. So as far as short-term incentive designs, who's made changes to those? According to this, 35% of the participants, and they're changing largely the actual goals. So I'm assuming that means lowering them. They are, what I find interesting, adding discretion at year end, and we talked about that a little bit before. So 62% of the 35 is a total of 22 overall percent of organizations adding in discretion to their plans. So that gives the board the ability to pay out a little more based on how they believe, the executives and leaders performed through the year, through COVID, and, managed efficiently and effectively. Same thing for the long-term incentive. There were 18% of organizations, so a little less than the short-term. So that's logical. That makes sense. That fewer would be modifying long-term plans because you're covering multiple years and you're still thinking, I've got time to make up, so we don't have to kind of overreact and make changes on those now. But I was, again, not surprised to see if they were the 18% that are making changes or did make changes to the long-term plans, that 91% of those, or overall 16%, added discretion in their long-term incentive plans. So important to know, largely because discretion is looked at as kind of negative by ISS and other shareholder governance groups. So it brings in that whole topic of subjectivity and is this fair, and raises questions, shareholders, employees, are executives overpaid, and it just opens a whole host of questions. And at the very bottom, the last takeaway I found very interesting is that it says that actions are yet to be determined, 55%. I thought, wow, we're half, second quarter, half are still deciding. So I'm so interested to see the next quarter's data that comes out, if half are still deciding. So it's fair, it's reasonable they're still deciding, because we're all hoping we pop out of this, right? We're all hoping there's a vaccine. We're all hoping the spread is less and less and we improve. So in a way, I'm not surprised to see that, but that is still a lot. Just wanted to mention about the CARES Act that was implemented, right when COVID, became an issue earlier in the year. But some of the components of this CARES Act impacts executive compensation. So if you're an organization that did take advantage of one of those loans, there are compensation limits or reductions on what they call the restricted period, which is from when the loan started to a year after the loan is paid back, whenever that is. And there's more information to come. So they kept that loophole open, like, okay, we still might make more changes, but here's what we're initially announcing. So one, if someone made more than $425,000 in 2019, they can't make more than that. Then there's the reduction. So executives who made more than 3 million can't receive total comp more than the 3 million plus half of what they made in 2019. So there's that kind of level of executive. And then third, on severance, again, looking at 2019 comp, can't exceed 425,000, can't receive more than twice of that as severance during the restricted period again, for a year after the loan's fully repaid. Don't know how they got to 425 is the magic number, but those are restrictions for organizations that do have those loans. I found this was an interesting piece of research done by the Harvard Business Review, just published in August.
Linda?
Someone went...
Excuse me 1 second. Before you go on, we have a question. Does the compensation freeze also include stock compensation?
Great question. Yes, in the CARES Act definition, they include salary, bonus, long-term incentives, stock, or other equity.
Great.
So all of that combined.
Okay, thank you.
That was a good question, and I should have detailed that. Okay, so again, I found this an interesting study someone took on. They looked at shareholder meetings in 2020 compared to shareholder meetings in 2019. And the high-level results they published were, quite obviously, participation was less costly because they were held using some technology remotely, Zoom or some other technology. They also found that there was less time dedicated to answering shareholder concerns, and there was less information communicated by the company to the shareholders. So it's telling me that when we have these more abbreviated Zoom calls, like our Zoom call might have been in person, if not for COVID, are potentially less effective. And also, the final was an observation that when you're sitting in the room with hundreds of shareholders and the executives are they're giving their spiel, and some of you have been in that mode, it's really helpful to see the body language and to see reactions of people in the room. And so, especially during the question and answer period, you really want to have that human touch available to you to see and hear, But anyway, they mentioned that was really a noticeable difference, obviously, and a hindrance. So anyway, I thought that was interesting to take the time to compare the two, because we wonder, what are next year's shareholder meetings going to look like? Are we going to go back to in person? So, time will tell. But this was done, this study last month. And then this is the final study. This was also done in August. We have 81% saying they're delaying annual merit increases. So I'm assuming this means going forward to next year, because we're getting toward the end of the year. Companies probably would have already given them out now. So they're delaying them. 23% have suspended 401k match. That seems to be something else that I'm hearing to be more common. And then 50% have given salary reductions. We don't know the extent of them, but that half of the people who participated had some salary reductions. Deferment of bonus payments, 19%, and then furloughs and layoffs, 46%. So
Linda, this is executive compensation specifically, or can you comment on rank and file compensation? Do these same numbers apply to the organization overall?
These are overall numbers. Good question.
These are overall, so it would affect the organization overall, not just executive comp.
Right.
Okay. Right. Thank you.
Right. So that concludes the formal presentation. Are there any other questions?
Yes, we have a couple. So back on the compensation chart that you showed for executive comp and the ranges, a question was asked about how much more does a CEO earn than a CFO? Can you give us an average range?
It really depends on the size of the company. In smaller companies,
comment on mid-market, maybe.
Okay,
Linda.
Okay, I would say $1 million to $2 million. Again, I would have to know more about the industry, but it varies, and it varies in very surprising ways. Sometimes I have found smaller privately held companies, PE owned or whatever, pay a lot higher than their counterparts on the public side. Why? Well, again, this is why you have to look at each individual situation and company. Well, if they're in turnaround mode or saving them from financial distress, they're going to be probably overpaying somebody to turn it around because they know it's a risky situation. And why would someone walk into something that may totally fail and they may not get their executive, payouts, and meaning the variable payout piece of it. And in that case, sometimes they'll give, flat guaranteed pay, to assure them that, hey, we want you in here, we want you to make this change, but we know it's risky, so we're going to give you this guaranteed cash. That's not unusual in a turnaround situation.
Okay, and then another question on this chart, Linda. Are these for public companies only? The base seems a bit high for the smallest company with revenues of 10 to 50 million.
Very good question. These are both a combination of public and private. This represents 4,000 companies' participation. So that is what this study shows. It could be high. Again, these are the medians. So for each of these, there's a wide range. So I'm showing you the median or the 50th percentile. There's a 25th percentile at 10%, a low, and then there's a 75th, 90th high point. So there's really a large range around each of these values.
So for our folks on the call, this is the value of, contacting Linda and the Overture Group to really dive deeper for you, to explore specifically for your organization. Another question, Linda, is during this COVID situation, can you comment on what you're seeing in terms of negotiating offers with employment agreements around salary and comp? Do you have any general comments or data on that?
That's a really good question. And no, I have not seen or heard. I have heard companies are hiring. If you're a CFO, you're definitely at the level where I would negotiate and get an agreement. I think that, when we go forward and get out of this, okay, things will be better, but remember that the best point in time you have to negotiate an offer is when you're walking in the door at a new job. So I wouldn't hesitate to lower your expectations just because of this. An option is to say, okay, maybe I come in at X, but because of this crisis we're in, but in 6 months or in a year, I want my salary, or I expect my long-term or whatever component you're negotiating to go to Y. And so do that up front when you're walking in the door, because it's much more difficult to do that after you get in the door.
Absolutely. Great point. All right, let me just check one more time for questions. I think we've covered everything. So thank you, Linda, for a great presentation.
Kathy, it's Susan. Yes. I think you have one in the chat.
Oh, do I have one more in the chat? I'm sorry.
From Jeremy. You're good.
Got it. Thank you, Susan. All right. Is the long-term incentive comp in this chart shown in green? So Linda, go back, that's green. Annualized, or in other words, that it's the annual benefit the exec would get even if only realized on a sale, for instance.
You mean a sale of a company?
Sale of a company, I think. Yeah, I think that's what.
Well, the compensation during a sale or change in control varies based on the terms of the agreement of the deal. But the green bars here are representing the targets, okay? So that means when it's granted to you, how much is it worth at the time it's granted? And again, this is 50th percentile, and there's a low and a high range around each of those values. So again, it's target, not actual.
Okay. Jeremy, we'll give you a minute if you want to respond to me in the chat if that answered your question. Another question came in, and I can comment on this as well. Do executives negotiate a severance agreement up front at the time of negotiating the offer? And
Absolutely.
the answer is definitely yes.
Absolutely.
So for those of you who are asking that question, last month our speaker was Laurel Bellows, a labor attorney, and she addressed that. And we have that presentation. Happy to share contact information and more detail with you. Just reach out to me and we will take care of that. But you absolutely want to do that up front.
Right. And I highly recommend Laurel. We've given joint presentations in the past, so she knows her stuff.
She knows her stuff, absolutely. Well, Linda, thank you so much and for sharing this wealth of data with us. Thank you all for joining us this morning, and enjoy the holiday weekend.